So I'm just going to very briefly introduce the panel. I'm going to go from over there. This gentleman is Sean Carney. Now, Sean, I have worked alongside. He's the former director for European Business Development for Tilray Europe. And along with Pavel Yuribchek, obtained the first license, now this is before MCAP, to import a cannabis-based medical product into Ireland. That was the 1010 Tilray oral solution. I then go to Shane Morris over here. Shane was, I always get this right, you have to tell me what precisely the role was.
Where?
With Aurora. So there was a little bit of competition when the MCAP program was first starting up between Tilray and Aurora, and well, Shane was leading the charge there, not just in Ireland, but in other countries in Europe. And Shane won that round and got the first official MCAP cannabis-based medical product on the market. So it's an enormous privilege. He's travelled from Canada to be here today. Sean came in from the Czech Republic. John has come in from the State of Maine, where he's now regulator in charge of policy. And our very own Mike Sikorski, he was recently over in Chicago, where he's part of this very interesting, can I get this right, innovation lab? Cannabis Innovation Lab, and is the managing director, if I've got this right, and co-founder of TRUSTT, who are sponsoring the streaming for this event. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the chief, as I like to call him, Eoin, who many of you have had the opportunity to meet. It's been an absolute privilege for me to work alongside Eoin in getting the Cannabis Summit up and running today. Thank you, Eoin. Over to you.
Thank you, Niall, for the kind words. Like with everything else, a team is what normally brings an event together. So the two of us there have managed to bring this event to everybody. So this discussion was about policy, and as we know, the policy framework across the world is nuanced in every single territory. So what better way to explain to everybody than bring somebody from Canadian expertise, American expertise, and European expertise to bestow what they think is going right in policy and what we could hopefully in Ireland and Europe learn about designing new policy. So I'm going to start off with John. Can you basically give everybody an overview of what is going right in America? What are the main states that are doing it correctly? And what are the, let's say, top 2-3 lessons that Europe can learn from what's happening over with you guys?
Well, thank you for the invitation. This is an exciting panel. I'm here with some esteemed colleagues, and I'm excited to hear their conversation as well. In terms of talking about America, I think it's important to talk about a couple of really stark failures that exist that set the stage or set the table for what we're going to talk about. The first big policy failure was prohibition in the first place. It's a failed policy. It's a failed policy that the United States exported across the world. It's a failed policy in every country that it touches. And it's created the types of policy challenges that we're experiencing with today, whether they're policy challenges around whether to legalize or not, or whether they are policy challenges around what legalization should look like once a jurisdiction has decided to take that step. The second big policy failure in the United States has been a failure by Congress to act on what has been an experimentation in the individual states around medical and adult use cannabis. That disjuncture between federal and state law creates numerous problems that really handcuff the states. In the introduction, it was noted I've recently been appointed to take over as the chief regulator and chief enforcement officer for cannabis, for medical and adult use cannabis in the state of Maine. I have licensees coming to me constantly asking what we're going to do about banking policy, for instance. I'm not going to do a damn thing about banking policy because as a state regulator, I don't have any jurisdiction over banking policy. That's an inherently federal power in the US. And so that lack of banking creates a variety of problems within the state in terms of access to capital, in terms of the ability to stabilize a business, in terms of picking the winners and losers. And so those types of types of challenges, like I said, because of differences between federal and state law, are numerous, they're complicated, and as I noted, they're handcuffing for state regulators. But in terms of what is going well within the United States, we've taken a fairly new experiment, the legalization of cannabis, either for medical or adult use, without much of a roadmap, and put together, for better or worse, systems, private industry that is regulated, systems that have done, in part, the intention of those policies, which was to deliver on cannabis demand and to deliver regulated and, in many cases, tested product to those who want to purchase it. It has not been, as I said, it's not been perfect. There is still a thriving illicit market in the United States, particularly in states that have chosen not to reform their laws, particularly in states that have reformed their laws poorly, or states that have not taken into account the legacy markets, the existing illicit markets that exist within those states. But ultimately, we have private industry thriving. As the first panel noted, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States and growing. It is something that is employing, Bo, you're here still, right? Yeah, Bo, he noted his jobs report that he does, is it every year, every 2 years? Every year. That's a great resource. Hundreds of thousands of individuals directly employed in the cannabis industry in the United States, and many more employed indirectly, the non-plant touching aspects that serve the existing industry. We've set up a regulatory system in the U.S. that in individual states in the U.S. that attempts to track and trace product so that the phrase we would use is you don't have product falling off the backs of trucks. So we're trying to prevent diversion. That is product grown in the legal market making its way into the illicit market, or inversion. That is product that is illicitly produced making its way into the legal market. Those are imperfect solutions that we have, but ultimately it's a hell of a lot better than the illicit market. In the illicit market, you have untested product, you have product that's grown with pesticides, you have product that's processed with a variety of other adulterants, and there are significant efforts in individual states to take those steps. And at the same time, there's expertise being applied to cannabis growth, production, and distribution from a regulatory perspective that isn't there in the illicit market. And so let me give you an example of one of these things that we've dealt with in Maine pretty significantly, and I think in a lot of states have as well. So there are a variety of different pesticides that you can use in agriculture. And pesticides are rated or classed based on how those products are going to be used. And there are certain pesticides that are used on food products, for instance, because if you use something on tomatoes or apples and you wash the tomato or apple, you're probably going to be fine. There's a pesticide that's used widely in the illicit production of cannabis called Eagle 20. Now, Eagle 20, generally, if you eat it, it's not going to cause a lot of problems for you. In a lot of cases, it's used in agriculture produced for food. If you combust Eagle 20, so you pack a bowl and you light it, Eagle 20's byproduct when you burn it is cyanide gas. And so you have individuals who are thinking, well, we use Eagle 20 on tomatoes, so we can use Eagle 20 on cannabis. And the lack of federal regulation around cannabis in the United States does not allow our EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, which tends to regulate pesticides, to say, don't grow cannabis with this because you can be inhaling cyanide gas. And that is something that for states, we're able to take that type of expertise, that understanding of what happens with a pesticide like that, and put out warnings or put out regulations to make sure that even if you don't think that cannabis is safe, you can at least know that legal regulated cannabis is safer than the alternative. Now, we heard a lot earlier about the stigma around cannabis, and I'm a huge supporter of the destigmatization of cannabis. The stigmatization of cannabis in the United States and around the world is steeped in racism and ethnocentrism, in keeping down people of color and poor people in the United States and throughout the world. And so destigmatizing this is critically important. But at the same time, making sure that people are managing risk when they're thinking about cannabis, understanding what cannabis can do to their bodies. I think the United States has a long storied history of doing all the wrong things when it comes to talking about cannabis, but there's an overcorrection there sometimes in cannabis industry and advocacy, where you hear things like cannabis is not addictive. It can be. Cannabis is safe. It can be when it's used properly, when people are using responsibly, and when it's grown and cultivated and processed properly. The idea that no one's ever died as a result of cannabis. Yeah, that's probably true. No one's ever died of a cannabis overdose. But the idea of suggesting that no one's ever died because they've used cannabis and operated a motor vehicle or had some other sort of accident, two very common ways to die from the use of alcohol, we count those deaths and injuries when we talk about alcohol. But the idea that we are overly destigmatizing cannabis in a way that people are not willing to accept that there are risks with it still, like there are risks with a lot of behaviors, I think is an important part of the challenge that we have in the United States and around the world. We shouldn't think of cannabis as bad in every way. We shouldn't think of cannabis users as bad people or people who are inherently trying to do bad things. But we also have to recognize that cannabis use disorder is a reality, and that if we are going to have a cannabis industry that is effective and effective too in protecting public health, that we're willing to talk about the risks at the same time we're willing to talk about the rewards. And we have a long way to go in the United States to do that. We have a long way to go in a lot of countries to do that. But ultimately, that for me is the goal. Where we can think about a cannabis user as just a regular individual who likes to use responsibly and enjoy on the weekends or in the evenings, but that also there are some health concerns for individuals who overindulge, either in an acute way or in a chronic way. And so I think it makes it exciting because we have a lot, like I said, we have a lot of work to do, but I think the United States so far has at least laid a groundwork toward working toward those types of goals and those types of achievements.
Thank you very much, John. Next to you, Shane, you've got a wealth of experience, your own very successful consulting firm in Canada, and have been around since pretty much the industry started. We obviously know Canada has their issues as well. Is there a comparison for USA versus Canada, which is better? Or is the same question for John? Is there anything we can take from the Canadian market to see what we can utilize in Europe?
Yeah, there could be a very long and boring thesis from a policy perspective on that. But look, from my vantage point, I work for the federal government or for the Queen in Canada for maybe 16 years, and then I did start up cannabis. I think what we were all shocked for in Canada, and the number one key difference I think between the US and Canadian systems is that in Canada it's a federal effort, right? It's 100% federal government, parliament, the whole 9 yards. And as a result, you get a very coherent, policy platform to be able to move forward, as opposed to in the US, you've got, MSO state by state. It's a patchwork. The beautiful thing about Canada, the way they did it, and I've got lots to say about the bad side of things, is that at least they've been able to come from a federal perspective. It's a national coast to coast to coast approach. The banking system, you don't have the same impact because it's federally approved. There's listings on a stock exchange, and it's and that has a huge impact for stigmatization across a value chain. And it's not just the users, where stigma has been used in social issues, but it's all the way across. It's me being able to come home to Dublin and tell my mother that I'm working in cannabis and I sell cannabis, and I'm probably the Irish person who sold most legal cannabis on the planet, and her not to banish me and never talk to me again because there's that stigma. So that's, I think, the number one key element is that federal piece, and I can get into a bit more detail as we speak. I don't want to speak for too long. The second thing I think from a Canadian perspective that's really good is and it's linked to the first one, is the export side of things on the medical side. I think the opportunity to have those exports and leads to a really key component that I know a lot of the Canadians really take as something quite serious. Is we have the ability in Canada to go across the world and explain our system and be able to talk and export, and there's Canadian products coming into Germany, Australia, France. So it's people are hungry to hear about the products, how they're produced. And one of my favorite things is when I come to jurisdictions and I say, and I'm the most boring person in cannabis. I literally am one of the most boring. I'm not your typical cannabis person. And so, to come to Dublin and sit with officials and say, look, I can show you what the solution looks like from a federal regulated perspective. It is not horrendous. The sky's not going to fall. We've done it, and we're exporting into your jurisdiction as a result. And that is a huge, positive from both the product and from the stigma perspective. What we did wrong, and I'll move very quickly through this because I've got a long list. The Canadian system was very quick. I worked in medical cannabis. My approach, my company's approach at the time was, we're going to do medical cannabis. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be, small percentage. Literally overnight, and no one knew. And I work in the bowels of Ottawa, which is the Washington, D.C. of Canada. It was a surprise that it ended up in an election mandate, promise for the current government, the Trudeau government. We were like, going, this is not going to happen. And then boom. And I know very well the bureaucrats that had to turn that election promise into a federally regulated industry that now worth today $4.2 billion in retail sales on recreational only. And there was tears, there was cry, they did amazing work. But as a result, there's lots of errors. There's lots of problems. The regulations are inconsistent. They're now trying to patchwork it, fix it. There's a review of the Cannabis Act. CBD got left behind. It's completely differently managed in Canada and the US. It's, basically managed in the same way as THC. We have people often forget Ontario, which is the biggest state province in Canada, has a very strange relationship with alcohol. Up to very recently, there was only alcohol stores you could go to run by the province, run by the state. It was like, I don't know, it's very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant approach to alcohol is all I could say. So unfortunately, they took that model and they really applied in several provinces across Canada, that same thing. So in Quebec now, you're being run by stores. What happened in Ontario, which is basically half the market, is that there was a last minute change where the province said, no, we're not going to run the stores because the Conservative came in and wanted to be pro-business. And now it's a mess. So it's a real big problem. As a result, people are still going to the black market. But anyway, I can go on and on and on nauseam, but I won't. And I think the conversations, will be able. But the point is, a lot to be learned from a lot of jurisdictions from where others are. And I'm quite happy to talk about my mistakes. Everyone has mistakes in the system, so no one else repeats them.
Thank you very much. Just a quick one for the both of you. Do you think that the American unregulated model or the Canadian regulated model is better for an entrepreneur? Does it seem to be that the Canadian model allows for more dominance by a bigger player and America allows for more entrepreneurs to pop up in different states? Or how do you see that? There's
different types of entrepreneurs, I think. Look, I'm a hardcore, boring policy guy who does regulatory policy. It's good to have a predictable regulatory system that everyone knows, that it's been applied equally across the board, that you try to understand that that's number one for any business, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's pharma, whether it's food and agriculture. That having a predictable regulatory system by a competent authority across the jurisdiction is huge. So I would argue that's a real strong point. I think... I don't know. I've seen a lot of U.S. operations, and if you're a certain type of entrepreneur, it can be very profitable. There is quite a bit that falls off backs of trucks. There's, I've seen some interesting situations. The case of mycobutanol and pesticide management is a huge issue, and I think personally, I prefer the Canadian model as an entrepreneur, but added to that with the stock exchange listing possibilities. But I don't know what you think.
So what I'll say is that in the US, there are some, I'm not going to take the bait and say one is better than the other, but what I'll say, in the US, I agree, it depends on the type of business that you are about whether you're going to be successful. And so if you are operating within one state, you can be a small business and be reasonably successful if you're managing your business well and you're well capitalized, et cetera. Not having banking presents a challenge. In some states, regulations change very quickly and very frequently. And so if you're not an agile business, that makes it more difficult. But what I will say is in a lot of states, if you're not used to operating in a highly regulated market, or you don't have the resources to hire the appropriate compliance and enforcement staff, or compliance and regulatory staff, you are going to likely be left behind or face a business environment that's challenging. If you are a large multi-state operator, you're going to have those types of individuals working for you, and that allows you to navigate the patchwork that is the American cannabis industry. So the ability to understand that when you're operating in Maine, if you drive a couple of hours down the road to Massachusetts, you are likely operating in a very different regulatory environment with a variety of different rules. And if you drive 30 minutes down the road from there and you end up in Rhode Island, that's an even different version. And Rhode Island is just getting off the ground. It's the latest state to legalize. And so when you think about what those regulatory changes will be like over the coming years as they get up and running, that's going to be very dramatic. If you're a small guy trying to operate in a couple of states, it's costly. Understanding compliance and regulation is costly. And so I agree completely. Depending on what type of business you are, you can be very successful in the United States. And for some people, they just end up biting off way more than they can chew, because either they're really good at growing cannabis and really bad at business, or they're really good at business and they're really bad at growing cannabis, and they don't know what they don't know, and they don't or can't staff up accordingly based on what they don't know.
Thank you very much, John Shane. Sean, at the end, you have a wealth of experience bringing products into the European market and have dealt with a number of countries' policy and legal framework. What was your experience getting these products listed in Europe, and what was the pushback from governmental forces, or was it more amenable from them?
Thanks, Owen, and thanks everybody for the time and the opportunity to be here. This is a great forum and a lot of good ideas. So generally, the kind of, it's what I will speak about on this question, just medical cannabis and access. The general kind of position in state administration is, I think like in any other industry, they don't want to do something that's new. They don't want to do something that they don't know, and they're going to have to learn, and they're going to have to do extra work. So that's generally, you have to understand that as the baseline. And so there was a general unwillingness to devote time, one's professional time, and it requires the stakeholders to actually, in their free time, get educated. And so this is something that there's no way around it. But what worked, and I believe it will work continuing going forward, even in other models, is cooperation with the state administration, and just kind of treating them like humans, that they have feelings and that they have some misconceptions, or they might understand something appropriately, and we have to kind of align on a few baseline points. And once you reach that point, then you can start making progress. But in my experience, it took in most countries, just to reach a point where they're starting to be cooperative, it took several years. And then once we finally could start getting products into countries, because we've, let's say, demonstrated on the regulatory technical level that this is compliant, we're not doing anything out of bounds here. Then state administration starts coming on board. But then, because it's the whole medical realm here, it's the prescribers in Europe are really against cannabis. And there's just no other way to describe it. And it's a pity, but that's how it is. And so and also pushing like herbal cannabis into the pharmaceutical framework, it's kind of unfortunate because it's preventing a lot of people who could benefit from like therapeutic cannabis. That's what they used to call it in Italy in the past, therapeutic cannabis. And that means using just herbal cannabis without direct supervision from your doctor, maybe just generally checking in. and that has a lot of benefits for a lot of people, but it's not encouraged. So everything's being pushed in this pharmaceutical route, which for the general population is it's not going to be that helpful. But for people with specific indications, it's great. You know, the pediatric epilepsy here in Ireland, you know, that's something everyone's familiar with. That's those stories, and so that's really good in palliative care. You know, end of life situations. You know, cannabinoids are really effective and helpful, and they bring people dignity. But this is actually, these are like niche markets within the overall healthcare system. And so where we are now is there's a lot of medical access theoretically around Europe or even globally now. But the actual patient access is still really limited. And that's mostly because of the doctors. And because also they aren't educated and they have enough on their plate already, and to get, you know, educated in a whole new realm in the endocannabinoid system. And doctors don't even know that this exists quite often, which is, you know, it's a terrible pity because it's really critical to our overall functioning as, you know, as mammals. So we have to work with people, take our time, but I think going forward as regards medical, I think it will be helpful if we can distinguish between people who have really specific needs that need really specific formulations with really specific dosage forms, et cetera, make it available to them without all these hurdles to jump through. And then people who have like more general conditions, which can be helped by cannabis, if we can kind of not lump them all into one bucket.
Okay, interesting. So more like breaking up the medical sphere into 2 or 3 or 4 different patient categories. So Mike, what is Europe doing correctly in terms of, we've heard about flower cannabis falling off the back of trucks. What are you guys and the rest of Europe doing to ensure that we've got a fully regulated industry across the European Union, that we can make sure we don't go through some of the pitfalls that we've seen our neighbours go through?
You know, so I think that, thank you very much for inviting us today. And we are coming from a technology and traceability perspective, okay? So I think that technology is the way to kind of actually remove that problems with access, building the confidence of doctors, so right, like focusing on quality, actually proving that the source compliance of quality is there for the product, and treating it as a medicine, not an alternative medicine, all right? That's from the medical point of view. From falling off the tracks, okay, like before with the traceability in States, we were focusing a lot, they were, because we are in Europe, but what we can learn, the lot of focus with traceability was around diversion. But I think a lot of focus should be starting to be on a quality with the traceability, okay? So we should not only look if the product is legal, if the product is produced to the certain compliance standards, but also trace the quality of that product from the production to the patient or to the customer. Because I think that's the biggest challenge, being in States for the last week and listening to other entrepreneurs and people who are working in the industry, not specifically producers only, but also people who are providing ancillary services, technology to those producers. You look at the biggest challenge with business efficiencies that grows the market is the fact that, first of all, they don't have the data, they don't know how to use the data, they don't know how to utilize it, the data is not uniformed, and all of that impacts the quality of the product that ends at the customer. And all of that here in Europe impacts the quality of product that ends at the patient, because today our legislative framework is about the patient, it's not about recreational yet. But through that patient access, through removing the stigma from the doctors and the patients, through technology, through traceability, through proving the quality, compliance, and the source, we can provide removing more stigma and move into the recreational market, right? And in that recreational market, the technology will be even more important because we need to look at more things, okay? That legality of a product, the diversion, which is important, but at one point we need to remember, in Europe, we're looking at the legal framework of, for example, homegrown. That's a huge impact on quality, because what are we going to do with the excess of homegrown products? How are we going to improve the quality of homegrown products? Okay, all those things impact the firm, or in all those things, the technology can actually improve the confidence, both the legislators, but also the access and the quality that is being concerned of the products.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd be remiss, Sean, if I didn't ask you, we've got a lot of movement on Prague and Czech Republic being, let's say, in unison with Germany about design and policy and legislation. Do you think Germany and the Czech Republic are going to end up coming to the same conclusion at the same time, or is Germany going to beat Czech Republic, or is Czech Republic going to beat Germany to legislation?
I think that they already are in alignment, that they're working together, they're sharing drafts back and forth of the their frameworks, their concepts, their end goals. There's differences in some of the specifics. They're working though diligently. I really can say on both sides, and specifically in the Czech Republic. I live in the Czech Republic, so disclosure. There is a unique situation happening right now where in most countries, as we're trying to figure out what is the role of cannabis in society, there's different groups, and everybody traditionally in most countries is fighting for their own interests. And that's how it was in the Czech Republic as long as I can remember. But recently, everybody has gotten on board fighting for one cause together to do what's right for society as a whole. And I know that might kind of sound highfalutin, but it's really true. The really divergent stakeholder groups are now coming together, asking how can we work together, synergize to push this over the finish line. Because really now at least in the Czech Republic, it's similar to what's happening in Switzerland, but from a more kind of salt of the earth approach, is that the Czechs are coming together and they say, look, we want to do something that helps people. Maybe let me dispel one myth that Czechs are all crazy stoners. They're not. They're just very normal people like you and me, but they're kind of pragmatic. They've been at the crossroads of Europe for history. So they've had everything forced down their throat from religion and politics and the different systems. So they've reached this kind of point, and I think they're national identity that they're going to make a decision based on their own direct experience. And what that is that cannabis it needs to be controlled. It has risks, but at the same time, it has benefits. And when used responsibly, if there's education and fair information, then it can be a normal, healthy part of your kind of social cohesion. That it's not something that is abstract. And so the Czechs versus the Germans, I don't want to say one or the other, because they're generally moving in lockstep, which is really great. And it shows that there is this potential for kind of a European solution. And historically, the Czechs and Germans did this about 150 years ago. Most people don't know it, but in the world of brewing, the lager beer or pills, whatever you want to call it, there was many people in the 1800s brewing beers and trying to figure out how to do it. And the Bohemians were great and the Bavarians were great. And then what happened was the Bavarians and the Bohemians, it's like the Czechs and Germans, they came together in the city of Pilsen and they created what was at the time unique. It was a brewery in which there was Czech speakers and German speakers working together to come with the right recipe for the best product. And then the result was Pilsner Urquell, which is now the best beer in the world, frankly. But and now what the Germans and Czechs are doing the same thing.
Very interesting. So for you, work away.
I think that was a really great point that was made about these sort of divisions and then putting divisions aside to come together to advance a goal. This has happened repeatedly in the American context, at least the problems, not so much the coming together. And that's true in our politics generally, but certainly in cannabis. And so early on in the cannabis fight, especially around adult use, there was a lot of people coming together and speaking in a similar voice and having some wins in Colorado and Washington early on. Very shortly thereafter, the fissures within the movement really emerged. And so you had groups of people who knew that their approach was the right approach and that their approach was the only approach. And so that created some real challenges within the movement and also some failures within the movement. We saw some ballot initiatives fail because multiple groups were trying to put initiatives on ballots in states, and when one got on and the other didn't, they opposed the other side. And so infighting has really held back cannabis reform in the United States, and so and certainly around the world. And when you think about the broader perspective, if you're a cannabis reform advocate, your question should not be, is my idea better than that other cannabis reform advocate? Your perspective should be, are our ideas better than prohibitionists' ideas? And until you approach it from that perspective, you're going to keep screwing yourself. And so when you are in that fight, especially the initial fight, once you pass legalization and you're in regulatory fights, you're going to have that sort of mudslinging and in the trenches kind of bitter fights over very small parts of policy. But in terms of the broader question, the biggest threat to cannabis advocates is oftentimes other cannabis advocates. And so being able to put those differences down, whether it's within a country or whether it's across countries trying to fight for the same thing, taking that deep breath, understanding that the other cannabis advocate with a different idea isn't your enemy, but just a friend with a different perspective, is the best way to move through those. But I've seen far too often groups shoot themselves in the foot because they're too proud to compromise, or they're too proud to understand that maybe the small parts that they're fighting for is not worth throwing the entire battle away.
Okay, thank you very much. Go on, Shane.
Yeah, I just want to add two quick things to that. First of all, in relation to the split, in different types of medical cannabis, I would like to go up at the policy level and, let's deal with the elephant in the room, where there's a lot of policy, a lot of political fear that, medical cannabis is just a gateway to legalization and it's bad. That's a huge issue when you're having conversations around trying to move the needle in a jurisdiction on cannabis. Taking the concept of splitting it, one thing that you can see from the Canadian regulations, they've actually got a segment in their regulations that talk about products a section called cannabis with drugs. And if you stand back and go, hang on a minute, what's that even mean? Well, what it means is cannabis is seen something different than what a traditional FDA drug is, right? An approved drug. And there's actually a third way in the Canadian regulations to say, okay, we predict that in the future there will be medical cannabis, there will always be medical cannabis utility, but it's more than likely going to be a combination of formulations with different already existing drugs, and whether it's CBN and melatonin, whether it's I can go down. So there is a way to protect that, and I think it's very important that we protect the medical piece. The second element that I'd like to touch on is 100% on, your advocates shoulder to shoulder should be shoulder to shoulder. In Canada, we saw this through, well, you're only a business guy, or I'm ex-government, so I don't understand the fight that I've had for 40 years with, trying to my civil rights and smoking cannabis. I go, fair, but we need to work together. And, some of the companies that did really well were those who actually brought together people who were hardcore, and campaigns that did really well brought people together who were hardcore, I would say traditional legacy advocates that, went back 40 years, and combine it with those who understood, modern lobbying, business approaches. And that was huge. And certainly, one of the companies I worked with, I work shoulder and shoulder every day with a guy who his last paycheck before he worked, and before we took him from the gray market into the white market, he was paid from a bag that fell from a helicopter. But now he's paid in a proper job and a proper work. He was a fantastic guy, super smart, and it was a real honor to be able to learn from him. So I think there's a lot to be done both on the split and making sure we don't infight for either the medical or the rec campaign that's ongoing.
Okay, thank you very much. So for somewhere like Ireland, let's say we have an archaic medical cannabis program at the moment. What, in your two experiences, what was the catalyst for the legalization or a full medical program happening in America and Canada? Was it lobbying? Was it consulting firms? Was it a mixture, as you said, or a combination of everything?
Yeah, so really quick on medical in Canada, it was the Crown losing court case after court case after court case. So, the Canadian government is terrible at losing two types of court cases. Number one is Indigenous court cases, because unlike the US, there are very complicated Indigenous affairs issues where, there was no people defeated in Canada like the US. So they have a whole different bunch of rights, and they the Crown loses all the time. The second group were medical cannabis access, where they just took the government to court over and over and over again. And you could trace back to 1998, the first medical cannabis regime, but they were forced to do it. And, when I went into medical cannabis, it was a conservative government. And the approach, and I'm not saying anything out of school, is that their approach was they came into government and someone realized that there's a government-run medical cannabis supply system because they were forced to do it out of court cases. And someone said to these conservatives, who are very pro-business, making money, said, yeah, we're losing $5 million a year selling weed. And they went, what? And they said, we're going to hand this entire program over to corporations. Let them lose the $5 million or make $5 million. We shouldn't be growing in federal facilities to supply federal patients. So I think, to answer your question, it's a combination of court cases and really good solutions that you can bring to the government who have a problem. You should never be just at the government for it. It's all about solutions, and you never just bitch at the government or officials. You always come with solutions and ideas and concepts and work with them. It's fascinating.
So we had a very different experience in the United States. It also gives me an opportunity to shamelessly plug my book, Marijuana: A Short History, that describes this in significant detail. But it was a grassroots effort in the United States that allowed the first medical cannabis program in California to happen. That was a decades-long fight. The true catalyst was the AIDS epidemic, the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so the use of cannabis, particularly in Los Angeles and San Francisco, to help ameliorate the side effects of early HIV pharmaceuticals was shown to benefit communities that were oftentimes left behind, gay and lesbian communities, poorer communities during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so in those cities, in bigger cities in California, what grew to be palliative care for dying AIDS patients, disproportionately gay men at that time, as well as cancer patients and other people dealing with end-of-life issues, really caught fire. And while it began as a grassroots effort in California, there were some political professionals who sort of parachuted in toward the end of the ballot initiative fight, or during the ballot initiative fight, to get that initiative across the finish line in terms of getting the signatures necessary to make the ballot, and then ultimately to pass the initiative on Election Day in 1996. And one of my favorite bits of trivia is California approved medical cannabis on the same night that Bill Clinton was reelected president, and cannabis beat him by several 100,000 votes in a state that he won handily.
Okay, very good. Is there, let's say, a line in the sand that North American companies are going to see Europe as an actual viable market and start to pump capital into the industry, or are we still playing a waiting game and see what happens with legislation? Is Germany going to be what everybody's looking at, or is, let's say, the medical program that gets launched in Spain, if that becomes very accessible, is that something that's enough to bring in the North American companies from American Canada?
That's a question. First. Very quickly, I think the question is, are they going to pump more money?
More money.
Someone who saw a lot of money going to Germany, Italy, and for free in France right now to supply a product, if I can tell you, it's more money. I am always hesitant to say anything about Germany because it's as every Irish person who's ever worked in agriculture will tell you, and I used to work in agriculture, it's a very strange, process, the German process to approve anything, and the regulatory frameworks. All I can tell you is that in 2016, I sat in a small kitchen with the Minister of State for Health for Germany at the time. He back then was super adamant that it was going to be German produced, German developed, and you're seeing already even Canada to substitute, they don't allow imports. So certainly in my perspective, whether it's more advanced medical or even recreational, I know they're going to have gaps in it, but Canada had gaps as well, and we didn't feel the need to import recreational cannabis from anybody else. For example, Uruguay or elsewhere. Certainly, I think it's going to be a pretty close shop, and if you're not in behind the German border, after a while, that's it. It's going to be a German operation. Straight.
What I'll say is, I think one of the benefits of a nation like Germany legalizing in terms of capital from the United States is it cuts down dramatically on uncertainty. The worst thing for a business and the worst thing for an investor is significant uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty in the United States right now in American capital markets around cannabis and in American cannabis industry. And I think a big part of that is not whether, a state is going to reverse its decision to legalize cannabis or whether an entire market in the United States is going to go under, but what the shock of federal legalization is going to look like. And so, there are going to be states in the U.S. that end up being net exporter states and states that will be net importer states when federal legalization happens. So if you're investing in a company that's growing, that has cultivation facilities in Alaska, you're probably going to lose a lot of money if you invest in those companies when federal legalization happens and cheaper to be produced cannabis flows into that state. And so I think there's a lot of money on the sidelines in the United States right now looking for a safer bet. And as soon as, Canada is an example, American capital flowed into Canada before, during, and after legalization happened because it was seen as a safer bet. And I think Germany and other European nations are going to provide that type of sort of zone of safety or zone of certainty around cannabis that the United States just does not have right now until legalization happens. Now, some uncertainty and some risk, you'll see investors going after, but the amount of uncertainty in U.S. markets right now is pretty profound.
Thank you very much. So for Sean, Sean, you want to work away? Yeah, of course, work away.
Just one small comment on this kind of this topic. Essentially, is what we're getting, where we're moving now with cannabis policy discussions in Europe is if European competition laws are going to apply or not. And I think it's really important that we hold firm that that's the whole basis of the common market. So any of these national fortresses, I think, should be really discouraged and not encouraged at all.
Okay, I actually wanted to jump onto our two European experts. What do you think is going to be the catalyst in Europe? You just mentioned there they're protecting our own businesses and our own regulations. Can you maybe both elaborate on what you think Europe is going to be the inflection point for us?
Well, I think we're getting very close to it now, and that generally amongst the general public, policymakers, essentially everybody, it's pretty clear that prohibition doesn't work. Really, nobody's denying that anymore, right? So we all know prohibition doesn't work, so something needs to give. The question is, what will it be? Here in the dial, if I pronounce it right, Gino Kenny has another bill for decriminalization, which is great. Gino Kenny, he's an Irish parliamentarian who's fighting for his constituency, and it's great that he's doing something. But the decriminalization efforts fail. They don't solve anything. So that's being floated as Plan B in Germany, but it's a total waste of time. Don't even go there. Portugal decriminalized 20 years ago, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic also, but people are still getting locked up all the time. The product is still illegal. You can't do business with it. Don't do decriminalization. There's one country where it makes sense, maybe possibly France, but in the United States, decriminalization makes a lot of sense because of the racial disparities, locking up African Americans in for-profit prisons. the United States needs to decriminalize. It's completely separate from the like cannabis consumption question. But in Europe, so I believe that right now we are at that moment, and 2023 is really important. And as Kai said this morning, we're expecting stuff next month. There's going to be stuff from Germany. There's going to be stuff from the Czech Republic. The European Commission, is coming up, and so we really need, I believe, at this point, to say prohibition doesn't work. We don't want kids having access to cannabis freely being offered in schools, and there's now the new wave is all this HHC products. This is just like the new spice. And, if someone thinks that this is because of people don't want to get so high, I mean, I disagree. I think this is just a loophole, and people are just using it because THC is illegal. And so they're going to get people high through back channels, through some loophole. And the easiest way, really the most pragmatic way to solve this is to say we need to legalize cannabis so it's not illicit, because then we can trade, and then we overcome these like national champion kind of concepts. But then we need to legalize it and do smart regulation where THC is simply accepted as something that's been with us, it's with us, and will be. And then we can essentially do away with all these kind of Frankenstein creations that are just filling a gap. So I think we're at that moment right now. Eoin.
I agree with that 100%. We're coming to the moment, obviously that catalyst will be possibly Germany or Czech Republic. There is a race, right? So we see who wins. But decriminalization doesn't work because it cannot create a legal, regulated system in which we can know exactly what happens, all right? So we're trying to find this, that's nice word, Frankenstein kind of legislation framework that will not improve public health, will not reduce harm. They're going to introduce the low quality products into the market, and which we cannot control. The other thing is you ask about the American companies coming to Europe, all right? There's a high excitement from the technology American companies to come to Europe, but they don't know how to move around that market at all, right? I think that there is a lot of education that needs to happen in States as well. What we do, you get the questions in America, can you say recreational cannabis in Europe, all right? They don't know anything. And I think that Ireland can play this role that it's always played for years of becoming that bridge between Europe and America and United States, especially from a technology perspective, where we can provide a bit of knowledge about Europe, and on the other hand, provide to American companies and that gateway to get into Europe and kind of bring that market faster, so we can remove the problems that the American market had, Canadian American market had.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think, sorry, go on, John.
One item I want to add to that, to build on that, I agree the point about decriminalization, and in decriminalization in the United States, we found even still racial inequities and biases post-state decriminalization efforts. One of the arguments that I rarely hear in a legalization conversation that I think is something that is applicable not just in the US, but in countries around the world, surrounds public health. And so a lot of people in a legalization fight are concerned about, well, what's going to happen with public health? Are there going to be drug drivers on the roads? Are children going to be getting greater access to it? What is cannabis use disorder and mental health issues going to be like? All valid concerns. But I think what is wrong is we think about, those public health issues, as if they don't already exist in our society that uses cannabis as the most commonly used illicit drug in the world. But the comparison should not just be, will legalization have this effect or not? But the alternative is, if we are throwing a lot of people in jail for cannabis, let's think about what the public health consequences of jailing people is. We know what those public health consequences are, and they're severe, whether it's around recidivism, whether it's around drug addiction, whether it is around the variety of other health outcomes that we can point to that individuals who are incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated deal with, not just during their time in prison, but over the arch of their lifetime. And so really in the legalization fights, that needs to be the public health comparison. What is worse, locking up in the United States hundreds of thousands of people every year, which we still do, and dealing with those public health crises, or the public health challenges that are represented by legalization? And that is a public health argument I don't hear made often enough, and it's something that is not difficult for the average citizen of the United States or the average citizen of countries across the world to understand. Everyone knows that the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated deal with a variety of problems, and those two, most people, far outweigh the potential public health risks of legalization.
Very much, John. So, Shane, you want to have a word?
Yeah, I agree with everything you say. On the decrim piece, I think if you have to step back and understand from a public policy, regulatory policy piece, that something for example, that Gino's doing is he's trying to, there's a theory in regulatory policy, and I could bore you all for a long time, that about opening windows before you open doors. Very rare, there's punctuated equilibrium, there's chances for policy change that occur over time. And the best way to do it is push open a window before you open a door. And decrim is sometimes seen as that window. And like Gino's bill is tiny, 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 tiny. It's really small, and it's smart from a political perspective. But the only concern I have with it, and it's what my other speakers, it's great, I support it 100%, but you could end up being a situation where you have decrim and then you've got cannabis and it's not tracked properly. There's no real regulations. There's no, it's a bit of a mess, and you've got something, but what you actually have to do is step back and go, okay, we need a proper, coherent regulatory policy framework, not just decrim. Look, it is atrocious that there's 17, 18-year-old kids that are going up into courts here in Ireland, and they're being given life sentences for no immigration or emigration, no jobs, no nothing, basically complete criminal record for something that's so ridiculous, right? And you have to get above that, and that's the conversation. And it's a little bit, it's for me, it's not public health per se, but it's public social health, because there's no reason to destroy these lives, because those lives, once they start getting destroyed to that degree, they can't get jobs, and then you're into unemployment, and then you're into community impact issues, and it makes no sense. Canada, at least Canada's shown that, they've actually gone as far as to revoke the criminal records and to give a whole review of that process once legalization occurs. And then in New York, for example, they've even gone as far as to, I don't know how to say this properly, but to compensate those social segments that would have been impacted by the war on drugs by allowing, for example, only certain people of color, I think, or to get their first licenses. Now, I know for regulatory policy, that's a bit of a nightmare, but it shows the intent is the right intent, and that's the conversation that we have to have. So whether you're left-wing Gino or Luke or any of that, you're going to have those conversations with the hardcore Fine Gael phenophallers on the other side. Those conversations are happening, and it's up to us to, as activists, to facilitate that cross-party conversation, that so when it does go to a vote, when it does it, that there's no risk for anybody anymore. You're giving them, it's a win-win-win for everybody in the stakeholder network and the equation.
Thank you very much, Shane. We're going to open up to questions now in a couple of minutes. Just one thing I wanted to finish on. Do we all agree that Europe is going to have a stronger pharmaceutical market than it is going to have an adult use market, just with the infrastructure that's already here and the potential for IP in that industry?
For time being, yes. Yeah. So for time being, you have that's the only framework we exists, okay? But in the future, obviously the recreational will be bigger. But again, we can take from the pharmaceutical industry, from the quality perspective, and build on that as well, okay? So I'm not saying let's do recreational like pharmaceutical, but the quality elements can be in there, and just adding to the decriminalization thing, okay? Decriminalization works from that perspective of that 17-year-old not going to jail, but it creates an awful lot of other problems, right? That policymakers later on look at it and say, oh, we made the mistakes, okay? So the only way for us is to really regulate and really regulate it well. And I think that technology can help with that a lot, give that confidence to the policymakers as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mike, for that answer. We're going to open up the questions now to anybody who may have some for our panel. If you could raise your hand, we'll go around to you with the microphone.
Thank you. So, what do you think about the implementation of public tenders by the government in order to motivate the pharmaceutical industry to invest more in clinical research and to fight more for sanitary registries about cannabis drugs? Do you think this could be a good strategy, hand by hand with an educational campaign about teaching people, educating people about this?
Right. So as someone who was intimately involved in tendering for Italian contracts, and I'm looking at my collaborator in too, right? And the various others. I'm not a big fan of tenders per se. I think there's better ways to do it with a grants and contribution system. The tender system, I think, unless you're building very large ships of military bases, or that's where I think that's about pharmaceutical tendering. Unless you're supplying into products into armies or into that's fine. But for a tendering process that for something like cannabis, really there shouldn't be a government involved in that basic wholesaling concept in my mind, right? So I think there's ideas about grants and contributions, setting up, research and helping them along the innovation process for getting data for safety and for efficacy, 100%. But actual tender process, I know it happens. I know it's a default way for many governments to operate, but I haven't seen much success in the cannabis tendering process, and I'm happy to.
So I am asking this. This is not my personal question. This was a question of a representative of the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico. And I was asking him a space for start talking about medicinal cannabis, because in Mexico is 100% legal. And his question was, why you guys still seeking and trying to push that the pharmaceutical industry invest in cannabis drugs instead of asking the government to be the one who motivate the industry and to ask these drugs, like, I don't know, like THC oil for palliative treatments in the palliative area of the hospitals, public hospitals, What about if the government start these kind of tenders, public tenders, then the pharmaceutical company will say, oh, okay, there is money, so I want to invest in this in order to be the provider for the government, and the government give this access to the cannabis for the people.
Yes, so having spent the last 15 years in Canada, where we have a very robust and relatively good public health system, the government pays for my drugs anyway. So, whether I get a drug with a DIN number or whether I get medical cannabis, once it's on the reimbursement program, from a federal and provincial perspective, it doesn't make a difference. But I know not every jurisdiction is like that. I think certainly the issue here in the pharmaceutical industry is that there's no IP protection on a lot of the cannabis side. So like we're seeing now in psychedelics, why the pharmaceutical companies not involved, because the patents ran out on, for example, MDMA in 1969 in Bayer. It's very hard to justify a pharmaceutical business case without IP protection, and that's a huge issue. So I think there's in Canada there's no tendering we just pay for the drugs anyway, right? So let the wholesalers, the private wholesalers, do what they do. Let it get it into pharmacies, but at the end of the day, we reimburse the citizen. So that's Canada. It's very different, and I know in the US, it's good if you've got your own private healthcare. But I think it depends. Is my answer to you. It really depends. But personally, what I've seen work better is the investment in innovation to support those companies who can get the data to get it listed with the government, and then whoever pays for it, whether it's government or private health insurance, I think that's more preferable in my opinion.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. In the United States, I could not imagine a move that would unite the cannabis industry and advocacy community more against a policy than to do something to incentivize pharmaceutical companies to enter this space. There is such an aversion to what big pharma has done in the United States, and there are theories, I would say some of them conspiratorial, about the pharmaceutical industry blocking advances in cannabis reform, that any whisper of that by the government without first addressing the myriad issues that exist in other parts of our cannabis laws would become a massive political scandal for any government actor who tried to do something like that.
Yeah, I understand. Only was thinking ways for trying to push the pharmaceutical industry in order to give us access. Was only an idea of this person and a comment I want to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Anybody else got any questions for our esteemed panel? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, how's it going? My name is Rob Leonard. I've been researching industrial hemp, and I'm just curious. So Ireland actually has one of the oldest hemp sectors in the EU, and people have been growing it for decades. But in the last 4 years or so, there's misunderstanding and a change of regulation around hemp, and the FSAI released a report in 2018, meaning that if it was containing any THC at all, it would be regulated. And since then, farmers have been cut off from supports and grants and didn't receive COVID support unless they were selling purely to pharmaceutical companies. So the amount of farmers with getting licenses to grow has been really set back in the last few years. And although since then, at an EU and a UN level, it's been clarified that growing is completely legal, there's still a big gap in the market to revitalise the industry and process it in Ireland. How can we help the government to take on the EU legislation and really get a better understanding to help grow the market in Ireland for industrial hemp?
Full transparency, I had lunch yesterday with the FSAI guy who's the main guy on this. And I know for years and years ago, because we used to work together on a different stigmatized plant issue. I used to be the GMO guy in Ireland, so genetic engineering. And anyway, if you remember back late 90s, early 2000s was a big issue, and the FSI were heavily involved. So the same individual is now working, he's not dealing with the GMO issue, he's dealing with the CBD issue. So all I can say on that front is that I think your problem lies with the Department of Health and some issues around some policy positions that they're advocating in the Department of Health, not necessarily the FSI. I think you're also, so in the value chain of hemp, certainly I think, you're, some people have tried some very smart ways around not doing extraction in Ireland and the press, and then maybe there's some more CBD isolate mixed in after your press, and there's some. The industry needs to. You're only as good as your weakest link in an industry, and I certainly think that there's some questions and some issues around that front in Ireland that make the regulator and then the policy owner of that regulator, so Department of Health versus FSAI, somewhat nervous. So certainly I think there's a lot to be done, and I think I've seen in Ireland, obviously there's a lot of work coming together with, there's two different groups of hemp representatives that's co-op, and I know they don't always see the eye to eye. I'm down to that level of understanding the stakeholders. But I think you need to bring together and have those realistic conversations with the hemp industry, and drag kicking and screaming FSAI and Department of Health, and then your friends in Chagas, and you've got other friends in Enterprise Ireland, and I've had Ford Ramona out to Canada at one point, so you have friends in the system. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you've got a bit of work to do, and certainly you've got to keep going hard and making sure that they understand their situation. And like the conversation earlier today around the Canavape and the court decision was fascinating for me and shocking to hear that all at the same time. So I think you've got a long hike ahead of you.
Early on in the U.S. market, there wasn't any data because it was federally illegal and there were no systems in place at the federal level to gather data and harmonize data and the like. As regulators and operators, what data systems are you trying to implement to standardize data so that you can make better regulatory decisions and make better business decisions? And what efforts are you making to standardize that data collection so that other folks in the industry and outside of the industry can leverage that?
So one of the approaches that I've had that drives my director of data analytics absolutely crazy is to always collect more data, right? If you have a question, should we collect these 3 or 4 variables, or should we only collect one? I always say collect more, even if we don't need it later. I'd rather have it than not. And one of the staggering things for me has been, and not just in Maine, but in states across the U.S. where I've worked with states or testified before legislatures, is just ultimately how little data they end up collecting on a variety of topics, whether it's on industry, whether it's on the internal regulatory processes. When I took over, I instituted a policy of collecting more internal data to make sure that the agency that I run is running as efficiently and effectively as possible around compliance checks, around licensing, around broader policy, et cetera. In terms of standardization in the United States and in conjunction with Canada, we have an organization called the Cannabis Regulators Association, CANRA, C-A-N-N-R-A. It is something that I would encourage individuals from any country to engage with, and I'm happy to provide contact information for them. There are committees within CANRA that are working hard to address those standardization issues. As you noted, because it's federally illegal, the types of standardized data collection and mandatory data reporting that we are used to in a variety of areas of policy just don't exist in cannabis. And so it's up to individual states to try to work with other states to standardize it. But that's a hell of a lot of work. I mean, as a regulator in Maine, I have a lot of things on my plate, and calling, the 20 other states with adult use cannabis, or the 37 other states with medical cannabis, to try to get our data aligned is just not a terribly high priority. And so having a central organization like CANRA work on that is really effective. But short of federal legalization, we have this patchwork that just isn't great. And having worked at Brookings before and trying to do data analysis across states, it's a nightmare, and you're comparing apples and oranges. People are collecting data differently. One of the big examples, and I'll wrap up on this, is looking at public health and public safety, and looking at the number of cannabis-related driving under the influence charges, or cannabis-involved traffic fatalities. The problem is states tend not to collect those data until after they legalize. So what they'll do is, if there's a fatality in a car accident, they'll test for alcohol, and if alcohol is negative, they'll do a full drug screen. And if something popped, whether it's cocaine or methamphetamine or cannabis or whatever, if something pops, it was previously coded as a drug-involved death, not a cannabis-involved death. And then they start collecting for cannabis specifically, and lo and behold, there's a huge spike in the number of cannabis-involved deaths. And so it's not just standardizing data within jurisdictions, but within jurisdictions over time as well. And it's a frustration of mine. I know it's definitely a frustration of yours. And so my advice to any jurisdiction is always the data that you'll be interested in collecting post-legalization, start collecting it immediately so that you have that baseline and that benchmark and then the natural experiment of what happens when legalization happens.
Any other questions from Jess?
Yeah, sorry, David.
Following her with this thing, I taught at local Olympic theaters and art in the playground. And I did what's happened about see how what because the deal was me, he says. The actual of a group beat back right on the board.
Just about the data, right? So like what happens in the United States as well, we have a lot of data being collected. I know, like there's a lot of data missing, and like I agree 100%. If you can collect from four data points, collect four, instead of one, because more data you can start using afterwards. But what happens in the United States is there's data, for example, collected with metric, which is not being analyzed or validated at all, right? Let's talk a little about uniformity first, but then what we actually do with the data, okay? You have a number of entrepreneurs, startups, companies working with the data around metric, and it's not accessible to regulator, it's not accessible to the community, to the industry, etc. Like so, the establishment of data collection system, this one source of data, okay, which is metric or bioattractivity, depending on the state. What happened is it was created without any consultation with industry, all right? So it was imposed on the industry. The regulator didn't listen. The companies won their tenders, and that resulted in something that is unusable by the industry at all, right? So that data collection is super important, but also how those companies are going to use the data, what insights it gives to regulators. Regulators can do actions on that data very, very quickly, not have another company in 5 years' time pitching in, or 10 years' time in California or somewhere, pitching them. Now you can actually analyze and validate or predict a compliance problem with that particular company, although it's sitting there for the last 5 years, So now we need to think about it in Europe, how we're going to implement those data collections that drive actionable insights as well, both for regulators and the industry.
Sorry, David, you have
Yeah, just a quick question, guys. I know we've talked obviously a lot about Europe, but I'd just like to get your opinion on kind of some of the other larger markets, like obviously Asia, the Middle East, and Thailand have obviously just went legal. So do you think once, I suppose, some of the other Asian countries actually start to see the tax revenue and the export opportunities and the job creations, do you think they'll follow suit, or do you think they're going to kind of sit and wait?
That's a great question. I spent quite a bit of time in Thailand at one point in late 2019, working with the FDA, working through their regulatory proposals. I think the opportunities are coming. The problem is that there is, and I can only talk from a commercial perspective, there's quite a bit of nervousness in, I would say, North American companies to try to do business in these areas because, how do I put this politically correct? Even in North America, you have to be very cautious of who you're doing business with, what you're doing business, especially in the US and Canada. The government looks very carefully at who gets licenses. Every board member, every influencer on the company. There's a lot of security issues. They're not worried about per se diversion. They're more worried about proceeds of crime being whitewashed through a newly legalized system. So I think the simple answer is yes, they're great markets. 2 points on the simplicity is I think they're going to have to mature a little bit before people get comfortable going into those space. And second of all, I think there's just cultural issues around, trying to do business in these places that could come back and hit you hard on your NASDAQ listing or your Toronto Stock Exchange listing, and it's just not worth the risk.
And to pick up on that, I agree with all of that. And an additional layer in the U.S. is Are people on State Department sanctions lists? Are they on State Department or Homeland Security Department terrorist lists? And so the concern about essentially washing money in some of these non-democracies, emerging democracies, and pseudo-democracies, the financial tracking in those countries and in those markets is just not up to what Western countries are needing. And so that's true for institutional investors, but it's also true for savvy investors too. And we're seeing this play out in the United States right now with Russian oligarchs getting involved in larger American cannabis companies and probably smaller American cannabis companies. And so that's creating some real market shocks for some individuals. And I think if you're an investor and you look out at it and you say, wow, I'm investing in the United States in this company, and this company might be having Russian oligarchs involved, I'm going to think twice about going to a market like Thailand, where I am dramatically less certain that I know what's going on behind the curtain in those companies.
Okay, thank you very much to our panel. If everybody could give them a round of applause, we're just coming to the end of this. So we'd like to thank our guests for coming over. We're going to take a 30-minute break now. If everybody wants to get some water and tea, we'll be back down with the final panel of the day with our main sponsors, Richard and Shirley, Professor Dibna Waldron and Boris Moshkovich. So thank you.